Thanks for listening to the Pioneer Made to Grow podcast. I'm Andrew Campbell, and when it comes to the past year, more and more corn growers in Ontario are learning just what the impact of tar spot can be. It's a disease that test strips are showing yield differences of 10, 20, maybe even 40 or 50 bushel differences when sprayed with fungicide or not. To break down the year that was, we've got two familiar faces with the podcast today, John Seliga and Greg Stopps, both area agronomists covering Southern Ontario, both in areas that have seen tar spot in their coverage areas. John and Greg, thanks for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having us on.
Andrew.
All right, guys, what I want to do is I do want to start with kind of the year that was. So maybe you can kind of break down just what this did, what the corn crop just in general did, whether growers were happy or not in your area. But then obviously what that tar spot impact might have been. John, you're kind of the far southwest of the province, covering, kind of that Elgin, Middlesex, Lambton, Kent, Essex area. Give me a sense. What was it like, John?
Well, everybody knows the start to the season wasn't exactly the smoothest, and we did get some of the crop in good time, but some of it was extended late into May. Yeah, we even had some June planted corn. I think in your area, Andrew, was some of the later planted corn, but coming through to the finish line, I have to say, very, very satisfied with a lot of the yields that we've seen coming out of the field. Are there situations where we were disappointed? Absolutely, and not unexpected necessarily, based on the amount of rain that some areas got, especially on some of the heavier textured soils. But what was really quite surprising was the level of tar spot that expressed near the end of the season, and how it impacted our grain moistures, because we took off some of the driest corn we've seen in years. Yeah.
Greg, what about for your area? You're kind of that Huron-Perth getting, up along the lake. Newer, probably, to seeing tar spot for your growers. What was the year like?
Yeah, so we're definitely newer to seeing tar spot to a degree. We've seen it come in late the last couple of years and never really had much of an impact other than finding a handful of stroma here and there. Not seeing huge visual differences in the past, but this year, our year started off really well for the most part. Large parts of Perth and Huron got planted in good time. Had a little bit more success than maybe John's area in the south. Had consistent rains. There were some pockets that definitely did get planted a little bit later as they caught some of those heavier rains in May. But things started off generally pretty well. Certainly, like by the end of the season, like John said, there were huge visual differences. There was a lot of tar spot there. One thing that I would kind of say is we saw it pop up in July here in our area. First kind of identified it there. It didn't really take off like tar spot can at times, and like we know it can from other areas, right? We didn't see it kind of rapidly progress from plants being green to being dead kind of a week later. It was a slow progression where tar spot undoubtedly had an impact, but it was a slow one, especially as we look at kind of end of August through kind of to black layer and actual harvest in October for us. It was pretty slow. At the end, you could tell big differences on tar spot. You could see those hybrids that were definitely weaker or not. You could find those fields that were sprayed, unsprayed, and visibly see that difference. But it was a pretty slow progression of the disease. And I think part of that is linked to how dry we actually were. For as wet as we were in the beginning of the season, we were pretty dry through most of August and September. There's not a lot of mornings where you would walk into a field or a plot and get soaking wet at 9 o'clock in the morning. And for John and I, who tour a lot of cornfields, we're usually wearing rain suits in September. It's not the case this year, right? We had pretty low relative humidity, very low leaf wetness, which really does squeeze that environment triangle on tar spot for sure, right? So I think we escaped pretty narrowly from having tar spot really take off, really expand quickly, and have a much bigger impact. We saw it, probably didn't have as big an impact as it could have, and yet we're still seeing some big bushel differences, right? That should give us all a little bit of pause.
So then, John, just because you've experienced it a little more, you've kind of been in that role where Greg is now when he talks about, okay, we see some, not completely, but we know it's coming and we know it's going to get worse is basically, kind of the feeling, I think. You've seen that a couple of years ago. Kind of give me an idea in terms of over those last couple of years, how this year does compare to past ones, but also at the same time, talk a little bit about, Greg mentions the visual aspects when you see tar spot, and we're in your territory, John. We've seen it too, where September is very identifying in a cornfield to those that spray and don't. A cornfield in September that is as dry as some look only really has one answer in my mind for what happened. Talk about what that does.
Yeah. Well, I think this year in particular, it was quite noticeable that the crop in many areas turned kind of overnight. It's like Monday you're driving around and the crop looked relatively normal, and by the end of the week you were very surprised to see fields that had essentially hit a wall and shut down. And if you dig into those fields and dig deeper, you're going to notice a range of infection and a range of influence on leaf tissue senescence. And a lot of that reflected regarding the tolerance of the products that were in those fields. So, we've done a fair bit of work in characterizing products for the disease, and we know that genetic tolerance exists. 2024 was really an eye-opener for at least for me in my territory, from the standpoint that that fungicide application, that first fungicide application, could still make a fairly dramatic difference in the health of that plant, even with that strong tolerance. And Greg can probably speak better to the silage component of it. I have some dairy customers, but when you're making feed for dairy cows, the health of that plant is critical. The grain yield is extremely important, but the plant health is also very, very critical.
Then, Greg, from your perspective in terms of, because, here anyway, a lot of fields now get sprayed. Like, it just is kind of standard practice for a lot in this neighborhood. For your growers that, maybe running test strips, maybe kind of determining whether that's the right fit, give me an idea in terms of what kind of impact you did see, and what are those conversations like for growers that haven't seen it before?
Yeah, I think it's always an interesting conversation to have about fungicide, and I look back historically, and through the area that I cover, we always used to have about 25% of growers who would spray their corn, and the bulk of that was either dairy producers producing silage or hog operators who were spraying their corn in the hopes at tassel time of limiting and reducing dawn development by suppressing gib ear mold. And those all make sense in the area I cover, which is heavily livestock dominated. But very few outside of that spraying for overall plant health or leaf disease, right? Over the years, we've done a great job kind of improving tolerance with northern corn leaf blight, and you name it, right? That most growers just producing grain haven't been doing it. So there's a bit of an interesting conversation trying to get guys to realize the serious impact of that with tar spot. But we're starting to see that, and those who kind of identified that early in the season, and certainly John and myself and the other pioneer agronomists, as well as others from around the industry, the chem reps, were out warning folks, and we did manage to see a huge uptick, at least through Huron and Perth, fungicide application, where I'd say maybe 65-70% of fields did seemingly get an application. A lot more trials went on for growers too who aren't completely convinced to kind of see it, and a lot of those returned pretty positive results in favor of using a fungicide. So we're seeing fungicide use in a few trials kind of show 20 bushels advantage, right? And depending on the fungicide product too, so there's some that are labeled for control, some that are labeled for suppression. The premium products that are out there for control, that the kind of public data makes pretty clear, do an excellent job. And you're seeing, instead of 20 bushel kind of protection out of those, you'll see 40 under high pressure, right? And so that's tremendous returns with the fungicide. And overall, what I'd say is, I talk a lot about other diseases, and we chatted, I think, even back when we did the previous podcast, a little bit about jib, right? And jib is a difficult disease to kind of really control, where we lean heavily on genetics to influence it. We have some distinct genetic differences with tar spot, but I lean very heavily on fungicide management to help with that, especially early, right? So that first fungicide application around tassel timing, where luckily I can kind of combine that with potential control of ear rots and other things that threaten our environment, really does a huge amount of the heavy lifting to protect that yield potential. Where genetics really start to take off and take on more of the load, I think, is beyond that R3 stage. When we get to end of August, early September, as we're approaching black layer and finishing off grain fill, that's where we see those really tolerant genetics really kind of play a strong role there, resisting some of that rapid spread of the disease. But they don't kind of uncouple themselves from that fungicide application earlier on, right? Like John said, you can see those differences with highly tolerant genetics not sprayed. You're still going to see the difference. Where I want to see them is partnered with that fungicide application, so that I can really reduce overall risk. And I maybe with those ones and those scenarios can get away from that idea or conversation of potentially having to do 2 applications under high pressure. It's still going to be a consideration in the back of my mind for some stuff that isn't highly tolerant, right? So,
well, that then leads in, John, when we do talk about, what we're going to do going forward. Obviously that spraying of the fungicide is critical, but I think growers are still thinking, what makes the right condition? Is this the year that, I need to make sure I do it because it's going to be a worse year? Do we have a good sense in terms of what made the environment this year make tar spot so much more impactful? Like, what's a grower looking for when we're getting to that spray timing to know, okay, I definitely need to do this and maybe even need to look at a second?
Yeah, and of course, some of the work that Albert Tanut has done and some of the work that's been done in the U.S. all identify that leaf wetness portion of the environment as the key, one of the key contributors to the spread and the success of tar spot being able to infect the plant. And of course, with tar spot, it's a polycyclic disease, so it continues to rapidly, when the environment is conducive, it's going to rapidly go through its growth stages and continue to reinfect and reinfect. And I think maybe earlier in the season we didn't notice that. Greg alluded to the fact that the disease showed up, but it maybe wasn't moving as fast as we expected it to. But when we're walking through fields at lunchtime, midday, and you've still got leaf moisture, you've still got dew on the plants, those are the conditions that are very conducive for tar spot to spread. And I think, it's difficult to be able to predict with high levels of accuracy to what degree you're going to have this disease. But I will say there were a number of growers this past year who were either not concerned about the disease or were not aware of how much the disease could impact their crop. And when they got to the finish line and actually harvested, they were very surprised at the amount of yield loss that was taken from their crop. And so it's a disease that we absolutely have to respect and recognize how influential it can be for the corn crop. Up until today, northern corn leaf blight would be a strong second back in the day, but I don't think we've seen a disease capable of the amount of yield reduction as what tar spot can.
Greg, to follow up to that, it's a great reminder when John does say this really is a disease we as growers have to respect. For those that are newer to it, or even ones that haven't experienced, there's a lot of corn growers in the province of Ontario that aren't necessarily spraying fungicide for tar spot because it hasn't been impactful. I think it's just a matter of when they're going to do that. It will march across the province over time. But from your growers' experience that are new to this, are they respecting it now that they have seen it?
I don't think we are yet, right? And I say that very carefully because I think, as I look across yields, we achieved some really high yield potential, had a great season for dry down. Tar spot likely contributed to a lot of those things, has had an impact on stock strength and integrity at the end of the season, but didn't have a huge impact on yield through my area. And definitely kind of see those smaller differences, maybe not as big a differences as John is seeing. There's pockets where I saw big differences, but the bulk of my area didn't see huge differences. So I think there's some of that confusion and how seriously do we take this? But I think it's not a matter of if, but when does it hit harder for us, right? And I draw you back to the conditions. You asked why tar spot was maybe so impactful this year, right? I think I look back to June and July when we had all this leaf wetness in the canopy. Ideal kind of environment for the material that's overwintering in some of our soils to come out, and for those spore loads to spread from other geographies, even from Michigan and further south into our area, right? We saw all those weather patterns. It kind of makes sense. And then, it maybe didn't expand as rapidly as we thought because we got dry. But if I look at 10-year averages, it's rare that I have a dry August and September like we did. It's maybe a little bit more common that I actually get a drier July or June than I get a dry fall, right? And so, in future years, we may not see tar spot take on or take hold and spread as early as we did this year, but it could spread way faster in August and September, right? There's a lot of that unpredictability that goes on. I would say one of the interesting tools that I found, and this isn't necessarily promotion for it, but the Tar Spotter app that's developed by some of the work out of the US and the extension specialists who feed into those models. Those apps and those models are never perfect, but I was really impressed with it from a scouting tool. And I heard some kind of frustration with them, I think partly because of not really understanding how those tools work, right? Where they were predicting very accurately where I saw pressure at the end of the season. And they were telling me that kind of as I was going in the season, right? They'd tell me my areas of high risk. Now you'd go to one of those in that moment and there'd be no spots. You couldn't find the stroma. You didn't necessarily see the pressure, but they're telling you that the environment is conducive. And sure enough, those same spots at the end of the year are the ones that were showing the heaviest pressure, right? So I think paying attention to the models and the work that, so many people in the industry are putting into this is really important as we go forward, right? So, we may be sitting here arguing over what's the right thing to do or not, right? But I think when we're seeing those red flags pop up by some of these models that are telling us, you need to take this seriously. This is a year where even if you can't see it now, you should probably spray, right? And we got to respect the disease, like John said, and you got to think through and realize how this disease works too, right? I mean, the disease is infecting your crop at least 10 to 14 days before you start to see the first black stroma, right? And if you're seeing that black stroma and there's only one or two of them, well, now there's going to be a whole lot more of them in the next 10 days, right? And it's just going to keep cycling like that if the environment is conducive. So it can be a very difficult disease to scout for, because when you see it first, you've already had it and it's already been spreading for a while. So you do have to respect that about it. You've got to think through what are the environmental conditions I'm faced with as I'm going into that timing of the year. And then as you're making your management decisions in season, you got to think, well, what's the next 2 weeks like? What's the next 3 weeks like? If there are long-term forecasts that you can rely on, which I'm not sure I've ever found one, what is the fall going to be like, right? You've got to consider all of those things as you kind of make those management decisions almost by the seat of your pants in season, right? Best thing you can do is prepare. But having that fungicide on hand, having that program lined up, and having that accounted for in your crop plans and in your budget, and selecting the right hybrid to pair with it, right? Selecting tolerant genetics that will really help reduce some of that risk, even if you screw up or make some of the wrong decisions on the management and fungicide end, right?
And so, John, that leads into that question about, this is the time of year when growers are picking out those hybrids. When they are looking for tolerance, is that just something that growers in your area, it's now a given that it has to have a certain level of tolerance for them to pick? Or what advice would you give to growers that haven't seen tar spot in the same way, how to prepare for it going into 2025?
No, great question. Growers need to absolutely consider tar spot. The tar spot scores that we have assigned, and of course, anybody that's marketing corn in Ontario today is attempting to provide that information, that evaluation around tar spot tolerance. I think growers have a tendency to like certain hybrids. A lot of that has to do with yield potential, obviously. Dry down. Tar spot is one of the factors that needs to be added to that list in order to plan ahead. Sometimes there's fields that are less apt to get a fungicide application, maybe due to the location or the complications around putting a sprayer in that field. Those are fields that you could target, some of the more tolerant hybrids with the expectation that maybe they're not going to get an application of fungicide. Where you have easy access, you can spread your risk and use some of those hybrids that have a lower tolerance score. Our sales reps are very well positioned to assist growers in trying to make those decisions and make those plans for the farm in 2025. But for those that haven't seen it, haven't experienced it, be prepared and make your plans, and then a lot of it will depend on Mother Nature next year as to what levels we see.
We've certainly seen it spread, Andrew, right? I mean, John and I are going to probably push to spray a lot of acres, right? And push to pick those hybrids with the best possible tolerance, understanding that, there are times where we will select those hybrids that have lower tolerance because of other favorable agronomic benefits that fit the operation. In those scenarios, then I'm just not compromising on the management. I'm getting that fungicide application on. I'm preparing myself for that. But there's a lot of folks likely going to be listening to this podcast from other parts of Ontario, Eastern Ontario, and into Quebec too, that we have seen tar spot show up now. Very, very low levels, end of the season type thing. It is possible, and it will happen, that tar spot continues to spread across those areas. I can't sit here today and tell you that it's going to be there next year or what kind of threat level it's going to be to them. I don't think we know that, but it's coming, right? So if I'm sitting further northeast of where John and I are today, where I haven't experienced tar spot, I'm paying attention to the conversation. I'm starting to prepare myself. So I'm thinking through tolerance, maybe not thinking through it as hard as John and I are today with our hybrids, but I'm going to start to include that in the discussion. I'm going to start to think through my operation and whether I'm able to spray or not, right? Like, do I have that equipment? Don't know where your operation is. Maybe you're making decisions on a sprayer or something like that. Maybe, the future potential of tar spot should influence that a little bit, right? If you're thinking about getting rid of your sprayer, asking yourself that question of, does my local retailer or custom operator have the ability to get through and cover the acres when I need it, right? Looking at my own crop budget, right? Should I make sure I put a line item in there for the right fungicide to protect my crop, right? Maybe I don't need to use it and I can kind of cross that bridge when I get to it next year. If I'm still not seeing pressure, if the environment's not conducive and I'm sitting in Ottawa, I probably can get away with it again, right? But if things change, at least I've got that line item budgeted, right? At least I've got that product sitting on my floor, or my retailer has it available, right? I'm thinking through that process and just trying to mitigate some of that risk, because when it comes, it will threaten, and that is what we want to avoid. And I want those folks who haven't experienced this yet to really kind of hear that message, because there's nothing worse than being caught out and seeing the massive yield differences that we have, especially when crop prices are maybe not the best thing that they could be. Seeing those yield losses are an extra kick. I mean, they're an extra kick when crop prices are high too, right? It's never fun regardless. So.
You know what, guys, I do appreciate you guys, kind of laying out your experiences, because I think as you do say, it's one of those where for a lot of growers who haven't necessarily seen it, it's coming. It's just one of those that then to be better prepared for when it is knocking on their doorstep, they've got some sound advice from you too. So Greg, John, thanks for joining the podcast today.
Thanks, Andrew.
And that does it for this episode. Don't forget, whether you listen to us on a podcast app or watch us on YouTube, by subscribing, you'll be among the first to know when a new episode drops. So make sure you hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to stay in touch, you can always follow Pioneer Seeds on X at the handle Pioneer Seeds CA, or me at Fresh Air Farmer. And don't forget, if you're ever looking for more information or advice, just ask your local Pioneer rep or visit pioneer.com/Canada.